welcome. And we're going to do a bit of talking today, but we also are expecting people in the room to do some talking. So even though you didn't realize you're going to be making a speech, you just might be. So anyways, all's fair. Now, the International Initiative of Disability Leadership is supposed to be about leadership. And it's good from time to time, if something is supposed to be about leadership, to talk about leadership. And so what we're going to try to do in this particular session is to look at the kinds of leadership that IIDL could contribute to the broader picture of leadership. In other words, the IIDL isn't the final word in leadership, it's merely another attempt at leadership. But what we're trying to do is to figure out how it might best do that. So in this sense, it's a work in progress. We don't really have an answer to that question of how IIDL might become good at being IIDL. And so we realized the only way we're going to answer this is to draw upon the people in this room to help us figure that question out. But we'll get started a little bit with just some thoughts about leadership itself. And the actual act of leadership, as opposed to the role, is action taken to establish purpose and direction. So if you're going to provide leadership, you've got to say, we're going to go in such and such a direction, and this is why we're going to do it. So purpose and direction. And purpose and direction doesn't come out of a vacuum. Purpose and direction comes out of the conditions of life that people are facing. And from those conditions of life, we then have to decide how to take leadership to deal with the conditions of life that people are struggling with. So in this sense, leadership isn't for its own sake. It's leadership is there to change the conditions of life that people are encountering, and that ought to be where we get our direction from. Now, as has been said by Eddie, leadership can be both individual and collective. Individual leadership is what often people think of, particularly when the term leader is used. It's usually associated with a person, a leader of some kind. But most leadership is actually collective leadership. And in this sense, social movements would be an example of collective leadership. In other words, a social movement might have contributions from many different leaders. And so in this sense, we have to see both the role of individuals as leaders, but also the role of networks and groups of leaders working on challenges and the benefit that that can bring. Now, it's also true that leadership can be used for good, and it can be used for harm. So we've had some spectacularly harmful leaders over the centuries, and we're all familiar with some of that. But we've also had some very good leaders. In fact, we probably wouldn't be here if we didn't have some good leaders to get us through some of the challenges the bad leaders have set up for us. So in this sense, not all leadership is for good, and so if we're interested in leadership, we really have to think about leadership that would benefit people with disabilities, as opposed to leadership that's not helping at all. So in this sense, we're looking for the type of leadership that would have a very significant benefit to the kinds of challenges that people with disabilities experience in their lives. And it's also true that not all leaders are either good or bad in that sense. They may be a mix. How many of you have noticed that even good leaders have their shortcomings? Yeah, of course, some people have spectacular shortcomings. It's pretty hard to trump that. I had to work that. So in this sense, leadership is necessarily going to have to be offered by imperfect people. So the standard for leadership can't be that our leaders lack or somehow don't have shortcomings. So we need to think about leadership in a much more human sense of leadership provided by people that don't have everything in their favor in that sense. Otherwise, no one will qualify for leadership because we all have shortcomings. And leadership really, in this sense, also is implicated in the question of values. You take leadership on the matters of importance and value to oneself or to others, and if there is no value placed on particular types of leadership, it won't arise. And in fact, there's been many attempts by people to offer leadership, but it hasn't been valued or appreciated, and in fact, there's been a suppression of leadership in many, many circumstances. And so in this sense, the welcoming of leadership can't be anticipated as a normative thing. It's quite possible that leadership could be resisted. That's not true, though, in many organizations, because it says in their mission statements they are there for entirely good things, and you just got to take them at their word, that they're going to go do good. It says so right there in their mission. Now, it's not just, though, that people have to have good values. They also have to be able to be proficient in turning them into good realities. So leaders just can't have good directions that they're offering. They also have to be competent somehow in turning those directions into practical strategies and ways forward. So there'd be many leaders that don't know how to translate good principles into practice, and so therefore they're going to be less effective. So we do better when we have leaders that are very good in a proficiency sense, but also very good in terms of the values and vision that they bring to it. Again, some leaders are better on one side of that equation than others, and so in this sense, that's the benefit of having lots of people involved in leadership. What one leader can't do, another might be able to do better with it. Also, leadership isn't something in which you act very briefly and the whole world is transformed. It often takes weeks, actually. And in fact, many types of leadership require generations of leadership. I've been involved now for quite a few years in this sector in terms of leadership, and it seems that it just was yesterday, and yet it's taken us a very long time to make progress, but we have made progress. So in this sense, leadership through time is also another factor, sustained leadership, because many challenges simply can't yield quickly. They will take possibly decades to make a difference. Disability leadership then can take many forms because there are many different leadership challenges. So the form of leadership, the particular aspect of leadership that people take on is what I call a leadership niche. A niche, of course, isn't a term people would use in everyday life, unless you're French, of course. But it is a very important term because, in this sense, people have a specialty in the leadership they offer, or groups might have a special interest in leadership. And for instance, people might be interested in housing, they might be interested in employment, they might be interested in rights, they might be interested in social inclusion. These would all be areas requiring leadership or niches in which leadership might arise. Therefore, since there is no such thing as an all-purpose leader, in other words, the leaders that are good at everything, we would have then leaders that have focused on a particular challenge and distinguish themselves by what they do with that particular challenge. And that means, of course, then we need a diversity of people making contributions to leadership who have different gifts, different interests, different passions, because we have so much to do and not all leaders can do everything, so people have to pick their challenges and be well matched to the particular challenges. Now, when we say the conditions of life, there could be many different conditions of life where we've seen leadership. We've seen in many jurisdictions a very big progress on employment of people with disabilities. In other areas, we've seen very good work on the protection of people's rights and the advancement of their rights. In other areas, we've seen huge improvements in the quality and relevance of some services. If you like, the kinds of innovations that have taken substantial leadership. Also, in terms of the roles that people with disabilities are playing in their lives, their access to the benefits of the good life in community will depend on the roles you're allowed to participate in. And so acquiring valued social roles has taken considerable leadership. And people are, of course, unique human beings, and so the results, the solutions, have to reflect people's uniqueness. And so we've had leadership around individualization or one person at a time type options in life, so that people get the life that suits them rather than everyone get the same solution. Of course, we're all vulnerable, and management of people's vulnerabilities is part of having a good life. And if people's vulnerabilities are not managed and supported well, then they may find themselves in difficulty. But if you have good support around your vulnerabilities, then that may not turn out to be a big issue. But when we look at the many vulnerabilities of people with disabilities in the social context, we've got a lot of unfinished work. Even having a suitable home of one's own. If you think of the numbers of people with disabilities that are living in places for the disabled, not in a home of their own, of their choosing, that's another whole set of challenges that we need. And of course, developing meaningful ties to one's community be another kind of challenge that many people have been working on, the kinds of connections people have to the community. So all of these things require leadership. Even though they sound like they don't possibly need leadership, when you get your hands on these kinds of challenges, you see that there's all kinds of need and role for leadership. Now, leadership isn't just there and that you can just sort of call up leadership are us and they send you their best person. It doesn't quite work like that. And in fact, many people that have tried to provide leadership have found that they can grow in their leadership, that it is something that you can strengthen in people if they have some capacity for it. And so we need to think of the things that help people grow in leadership, otherwise they stay the same and don't rise to the challenges. And this creates many challenges, for instance, attracting and cultivating new and younger leaders, because if you run out of leadership because you're not growing new, younger leaders, then there will come a day when there are no leaders, because the young have to be the next wave of leaders. And if the young are not welcomed, then they'll go somewhere else with their leadership. And so fostering the renewal of leadership through the young is very important. Helping people find their leadership niches, finding the type of leadership that suits them, almost answering the question of what kind of leader will I be when I grow up, is a personal question. People don't always know the answer to that, but it's an important question. And then renewing leaders so that they remain effective and faithful to key values and commitments. We've seen leaders that have not renewed themselves and have quickly become out of date or have gone sort of lost the plot and so on. So keeping leaders focused is very important. And in the case of IIDL, it also has some leadership challenges. It's not, IIDL is a work in progress. It is positioned, because it exists as an international entity, it is positioned to do good work on leadership. But the role of IIDL relative to leadership is still to be determined. It is still ahead of us. So one shouldn't assume that there's some people at IIDL in the back room who have figured out how to move things forward. First of all, they can't even find the back room, quite apart from cook up some kind of conspiracy there. So in this sense, what we're trying to say is that there's a need for all of us to participate in defining just how we're going to move ahead with leadership, and that's, of course, a collective discussion that we need, not just this time, but many times. There are some aspects of international leadership strengthening and development that are already being done well by other groups, and there's no need for IIDL to do what other groups have done very well. But it also raises the question, what's not being done well that IIDL could do something with? And again, it's not always obvious what that is, but it's a very good question to ask ourselves. And IIDL has done a number of things that are very important already. It's very important to give IIDL credit for linking leaders with other leaders already. So in this sense, that's a function that IIDL was set up to do, and it's been doing it quite well now. And again, we owe a great deal in this to imitating what IIMHL has done, because they've been doing it for longer, and we've been able to benefit a great deal from their role modeling of how they did this. And it's interesting, to their credit, they have helped us get started, which is unusual. You know, they've been very generous with creating space for us. So we've sort of been adopted by them for the moment till we get to be grown-ups, and then we can do our own thing, you know. We've also, and you can see it in many of the exchanges, we've identified the areas of life and quality of life of people that are needing to be struggled with. And so in the sense, one of the questions of IIDL's leadership is to identify the areas where leadership is needed and help define, if you like, the type of leadership that would be most helpful, or has been most helpful. And a lot of this has been somewhat a reflection too, not only of changing conditions on the ground, but also changing people's mindsets and outlooks and vision for things. That too is an important part of leadership. Without vision, without shifting in their thinking, there's really no new pathways. There's no way to solve many of these challenges. So that's another aspect of leadership. So returning to this point, IIDL is not needed to do what others are doing. It needs to be able to define what it's going to do that others may not be doing. And that role may involve many different aspects of leadership. We're going to get you to be thinking a little bit about that today. Now, that leadership isn't just leadership that IIDL could do. It may be that IIDL could join with others in some leadership initiatives, because we would have many allies on some issues. So in this sense, you could think about what IIDL could do just by itself, but also how might IIDL partner with others on occasion and join forces so that we're working in sync with others of like mind. These exchanges have uncovered examples of leadership that are very, very important, that people wouldn't have known of in many cases. In other words, that the part of what IIDL is good at is, if you want to know potentially who's doing what where, then a network like this can be very, very helpful. And in this sense, many very good examples of leadership have been located, and of course people are now in contact with, and that has produced a kind of cross-fertilization of thinking well beyond borders, to use Frederick's talk this morning. I was reminded of that. So in this sense, there's work to be done at identifying future examples like that of leadership, because in my experience, a lot of good efforts at leadership are not necessarily well known beyond their area, and groups like this could be very helpful in drawing attention to that. Now, there are also international leadership niche networks. In other words, networks that are already existing that we're not tapping into. For instance, there's lots of work being done on employment, on education, on social inclusion, on rights. Many of these networks are also sources of leadership, could we be doing more with them? In other words, does IIDL just do its own thing, or could we, in some instances, do more in conjunction with some of these existing networks? That's a very interesting kind of question or possibility for us. And also, people with disabilities are providing leadership in many, many places in our world. And again, what's the role of IIDL in supporting the leadership that comes from people with disabilities themselves? Not all people with disabilities are getting the kind of support in their leadership that they ought to rightfully get. And is there something that IIDL could be doing that would be helpful to strengthening the hand of people with disabilities that are providing leadership? It's something we should ask ourselves. And then there are many leading edge initiatives in which there is leadership underway that we could play a greater role in supporting people who are trying to do something at the leading edge. But what exactly would be the things that we could or should do to help those efforts on the ground to turn principles into action or words into deeds and things of this sort. So these are examples of things that we should think of. So what we're going to have after we've heard from Lene is we're going to be in teams on the ground here, and you're going to start identifying some questions that you might like to contribute to, and we're going to record from you what your suggestions are, what your thinking is in terms of any of these questions. So in the groups that you work in, you can take all or a few of the questions and decide to try to think about, what kind of advice you want to give. And I'll go through those questions very briefly. They tend to a little bit overlap inevitably, but they are important questions to get you started. For instance, one would be, what might be some important leadership networks that IIDL should link with in future years? Who aren't we in touch with that we should be in touch with, who are doing good work in terms of leadership, either nationally or internationally? What are some examples of important leading edge work that IIDL should link with? Who is providing leadership that we're not basically engaging with at this point, and maybe we should be engaging with them? That's a very good question. And again, as I said earlier, what are some examples of leadership being provided by persons with disabilities, and what should be highlighted as people or groups that we should be in touch with about that particular issue, or how might we cooperate with their advice and guidance on many things? Again, we've talked about leadership networks that we're not currently involved in, but we might get involved in, or in some form or fashion going forward. Also, in particular leadership niches, where is the best work being done, and what should we be doing to link into some of that work? Just for example, I'm constantly asked this question by people: where in the world is such and such happening? Where are the best examples of this or that? And obviously, that question is going to keep coming up and keep coming up, and what part do we play in addressing a question as important as that? Also, where is leadership being provided, important leadership, that it isn't appreciated as being important? For instance, there be many examples of leadership that's quite profound, but it isn't particularly appreciated even in the locality where the leadership is being offered. So in this sense, there's unappreciated leadership, and what to do about unappreciated leadership. And there are, it's interesting to me as a person that's been very interested in this, is just how many good things are not known beyond their locality, and yet what they're doing would be very impressive if people could just see it. So in this sense, it's sort of unknown, spectacular leadership, and we need to correct that. And also, what are some investments in leadership development that that could be made so that leaders are more likely to arise? What supports could be put in place that would facilitate the emergence of leadership and the linking of leaders to other leaders? What are those kinds of supports that would be helpful to create? And then just this last point would be, a lot of leadership is at the level of the mind. In other words, that leadership, one form of leadership is that people that can think and have vision in the mind, because so much is leadership is really in seeing the world and thinking about the world in new ways, conceptual and otherwise. And so a lot of leadership is really the mental work of reinventing our world, and what could we be doing to draw attention to that kind of work, which is also very important. So lots of leadership challenges. I don't want to go on and on about them, but we do want you to be thinking about these, and when we get into groups talking about it, you can kind of pick your favorite subject area, and we'll see what we do with them. Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Lene.